What's up, everybody? Welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think of today's discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living in Iraq and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit down video. I also want to shout out our great folks listening currently on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Pods. Welcome in. Make sure if you enjoy the show, you leave us a detailed review and a 5-star rating. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? We are back for another weekly episode of The Sit Down, and this is episode 118. I am your host, Jeff Nadu, and we are rocking and rolling here. I hope you had a good week. Another time, another day, another dollar, and another episode. We are into August now, and July really flew by. I don't know about you, but it seems like it really flew by. I mean, I thought it seems like just yesterday it was July 4th. Now it's essentially August 4th. I mean, it's August 2nd or 1st whenever you're listening to this show. So yeah, time flies when you're having fun, I guess they say. But you know how we do it on this show. We're right back at it. And we got a great one planned for you today. We're going to talk about Angelo Bruno. A lot of people have asked me about doing Angelo Bruno. We've done plenty of Philly people on this show. One of the first episodes we did was Nicky Scarfo. We've done all sorts of Philly shows, and this one's going to be a good one because not only are we going to talk about the life of really one of the most powerful people ever connected to the mob, but we're going to talk about the history of the Philly mob pre Angelo Bruno. We've heard a lot about Nicky Scarfo and John Stanfa and Joey Molino, but what happened pre Bruno? And that's kind of the big question. And Bruno's such an interesting guy because he kind of, in a way, has always gotten the same kind of reputation of someone like Paul Castellano. Oh, Bruno was just this docile guy, and he was all about money, and which he had plenty of. And he didn't hurt anyone, or didn't kill anyone, or he didn't show force. But that's not exactly true. And we're going to get into all that. We're actually going to talk about guys like a lot of history, a lot of pre-Bruno. What happened in the 10s, the 20s? I mean, Angelo Bruno was born in 1910, but the Philly mob has been around for years, and we're going to talk about all that and more. So sit back, relax. I hope you enjoy this one. This is definitely a very historical episode, which I have to say is quite refreshing. I talk so much about the 80s and the 90s and even the 2000s. It's nice to kind of go back and understand how these families were built and how they were made. And we're going to do a lot of that, in the future. These separate families, kind of the etymology of them and how they were created. And I want to, during this episode, shout out some great resources that I think you guys could check out. And if you're into that sort of thing, learn more. Before we get into Angelo Bruno, though, I want to tell you about my bookie. And guys, look, I've talked about my bookie a lot. My bookie is essentially the presenting sponsor of this show. And just for listening to us, just for viewing us, we're going to give you some goodies here today. Now, we've all been there before. You want to go to the casino, but maybe life's calling, your wife's nagging you, you got to take the kids to soccer practice. Maybe you want to gamble, maybe you want to bet on some sports. Well, MyBookie's new and improved online casino is here and ready to change the game. You can dive into all sorts of things, including truly realistic casino experiences featuring the latest in slots, jackpots, and even live dealer action. So basically, you can go to the casino, but be in your house. You can take advantage of things like weekly blackjack tournaments and a brand new collection of high-end games for, yes, of course, real cash rewards. You're going to get a real life Las Vegas or Atlantic City type experience where the action's in your hands. Now, your adventure can start right now at MyBookie Casino. And remember, not only are there casino games, but you can get involved in sports betting. And it's August, which means in just around 3 weeks, college football begins. You can begin today with a generous sign-up bonus just for listening or viewing this show. You can use promo code SITDOWN. Again, all one word, SITDOWN. And you're going to get a 50% match on deposits up to $1,000. So if you deposit $500, MyBookie is going to give you $250 in casino or sports betting cash to reinvest. You're also going to get a $10 casino chip on top of it. Your adventure starts now. And again, just because we love you, that's not all. You're going to get a revamped loyalty program, which ensures you get extra things like rewards, free spins, cashback offers, and other VIP perks. The more play, the more you win. Again, right now, go to MyBookie Casino and Sports Betting and enter promo code SITDOWN when you open your account. That's promo code SITDOWN to secure yourself a weekly deposit bonus. All you got to do, www.mybookie.ag. Again, promo code SITDOWN. All right, everyone, let's get into the episode. This is one that I spent a lot of time on, which I always do. So I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into the very interesting Angelo Bruno on the sit down. Angelo Anellaro, yes, Angelo Anellaro. Angelo Bruno's name is not Angelo Bruno. He was actually born Angelo Anellaro, and he would be born on May 21st, 1910, in Villa Alba, which is in the province of Caltanissetta in Sicily. Villa Alba is a pretty interesting municipality in Sicily. You know, when you're understanding kind of the geography of Sicily, remotely and understand that all of these towns, whether it's in Palermo or Caltanissetta or Siaca or Agrigento or wherever, all of these towns are controlled by the mob, right? The Sicilian mafia. There, that goes back decades and centuries, essentially. Now, Angelo Bruno wasn't in Villa Alba for very long. His family would actually emigrate, but I want to talk a little bit about Villa Alba. Villa Alba was actually run for decades by legendary Sicilian mafia boss Calogero Vicini, and he ruled back from the 1890s on. And he was an incredibly influential boss. And, you know, remember, really into the heyday of Angelo Bruno and into the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, Angelo Bruno always made it a point to connect back to his roots. And we'll learn that in Philadelphia, they're very territorial. And most mafia families were. Like the etymology of these families, it was very much rooted in where you were from, whether it was in Calabria or in Sicily or wherever. And that's where, at least in Philly, a lot of the early mob family, if you will, started. It was a lot of just kind of small groups from certain areas, whether it was Cacamo or Villa Alba or wherever. Angelo's family would actually early on come to America in and around 1911 or 1912. So Angelo Bruno was a baby at that point. And according to Eric Stonefelt, a great historian with the Mob Archaeologists, he would say that Bruno's family actually comes into America, into Trenton, New Jersey from Sicily. They would settle, we would have to imagine, in the Chambersburg neighborhood, which for years was kind of the Italian community in Trenton. Now, they wouldn't be in Trenton for very long. Angelo Bruno's father would move his wife and kids to Philadelphia, into the Italian market section of Philadelphia, which is really so interesting because this is a photo from 1909 in the Italian market. And really, in the first 20 minutes of the show, we're going to talk a lot about the area of Washington Avenue, 9th Street, 8th Street, Christian Street. You know, that area, if you're familiar with South Philadelphia, which again today is the present day Italian market, that was the spot where the mafia ruled, the Black Hand ruled. All these people we're going to get into, whether it's Sabella or Joavina or Angelo Bruno, all of these people were from Christian Street, the Italian market, right? Now, today, it's a little bit different. The mob today is south. They're more towards like Argan Avenue, Packer Avenue. They live in that general vicinity. But a lot of, even like when you look into people like, you know, you know, Phil Testa or Nicky Scarfo or even, you know, some of those folks, they were from the area of we're talking about here. This is where immigrants came in the 1880s, 1890s into the 1900s. Upon coming to Philadelphia, Angelo Bruno's father, Michael, would actually have some sort of small grocery store, which he would have for years until he passed away sometime in the 40s. But Angelo Bruno, his family, at least his father, were just ordinary people. There was no connection that his father had to the mafia. But we'll learn that quickly changes for young Angelo Bruno. So I kind of want to get into before we get into the life of Bruno, I want to talk about kind of how the mafia started in Philadelphia. And most historical records, when you talk about Philadelphia, they will mention that the first boss was a guy called Salvatore Sabella. And a lot of them will tell you that Sabella was a New York guy. He had come over from Castellammare del Golfo into New York. And he was kind of an early mainstay in the D'Aquila crime family, which would be your modern day Gambino family. A lot of records will tell you that Sabella is kind of sent to Philly to be the essentially representative in Philadelphia. But it also allows him to flap his own wings, create his own city, his own family, and kind of plant his flag there as, the crime boss. Now, Sabella had a lot of recruitment early on. He was in a faction led by a guy called Giuseppe Traina. And if you know anything about Traina, he was a close aide to Salvatore D'Aquila. Now, history will tell us that Sabella comes to Philadelphia in and around 1919, which would make at the time Angelo Bruno is 9 years old. Obviously, a little too early to be involved with the mafia. But what I would find out, and what most documenters will tell you, including historians, is that there's a lot of documented evidence that there was a lot of mafia in Philadelphia before Sabella in 1919. And the first known crime boss in the area of the Italian market was allegedly a guy, Francesco Doncic Bariali. And I would learn, according to a December 3rd article in the Philadelphia Inquirer from this, it's even hard to read, from this edition right here. According to that, there is mention of mob activity in that area. Now, in that issue in 1903, a resident from the area of 522 Carpenter Street, which isn't far from Christian Street, which is the Italian market in South Philly, would complain to police that he was extorted out of $20 and forced to declare loyalty to a group operating from a home at 808 Carpenter Street. Now, Carpenter Street is in that general vicinity of South Philly. So, what do we kind of learn there? Is that there's evidence in the early 1900s, 1903, 1902, 1904, that there are certain small groups of Italians that are working together and extorting people. Now, that may have been the Black Hand. We don't exactly know. But when we look at the timeline of immigrants in South Philadelphia, in 1882, it was reported that in South Philly, there were 33,000 Italians by 1882 in South Philadelphia. And by 1910, there are a lot of Italians. I mean, in fact, in 1920, 35% of South Philly was actually foreign born. South Philly is quite big. I mean, but nearly half of the people there are from another country, right? They had come over within the last several years. So Bruno comes in to kind of an interesting time, right? There had been notions that the mob was already there, and it was very ethnic, obviously. Now, when we look at kind of the family in and around 1905, 1907, the pre-Sabella years, if you also know anything about Nicola Gentile, Gentile would document, he was one of the first people to document. He had been born in like the 1880s. And he documents that in 1904, one thing he would say in his writings is that he was actually a made member and became a made member in Philadelphia. Now, he doesn't say much about the family at that time, but he was made in the city. Most, we would have to imagine, came in South Philly. So there's a lot of pre-reason to believe that Sabella was not the first mafia boss, if you will, in Philly. That was actually there had been mob folks there really since the late 1800s, early 1900s. So kind of interesting. But we kind of would find that out. We hear a lot of this, and I talk all the time to RJ Roger about this, and he always says to me, like, he finds it funny when people say, "Oh, well, the mafia was created in 1930, 1931, when Lucky Luciano formatted the commission." And it's like, well, no, I mean, there were all sorts of people that were quote unquote mobsters in America, in New York and in Philly and all these other areas way before. I mean, look at in New Orleans in the 1800s. I mean, there had been mafia people there forever. Now, Lucky Luciano obviously created the commission and made it a lot more uniformed and hierarchical, but that's not to say that there weren't people here. That's kind of the notion, and that's just not true. Um, Now, as we know from one of the greatest mafia books ever created, Before Bruno by Celeste Morello, when documenting the Philly mob. Look, if you're interested in the Philly mob, you got to go check this out. If you can find this book, there's 3 books in the series. It's incredibly well done. She kind of talks about Sabella in that. There's a lot of information about Salvatore Sabella, the kind of guy he was. But I want to kind of bring it back to Bruno, because let's kind of fast forward to 1919, 1920, when Sabella takes over. Bruno is kind of in a weird spot. And he's in a spot where a lot of gangsters are in, where they're young kids, let's say 10, 12 years old, and they're wrestling either between the fact that their father is a legitimate businessman or he's in the mob himself, and he has something that predates back where he's kind of created to be in the mob. Bruno wasn't necessarily that, in a way, because his father was a legitimate guy. The problem was, in the 20s, this was a huge time, as we know, in America. The Volstead Act had been repealed, or not repealed, but created, and bootlegging was huge, right? There were hoodlums running around. There were different small groups that were taking over all the illegal rackets. And Bruno kind of has one eye in the streets, but he also is trying to work for his father and have a legitimate life. But it was kind of documented early on that young Bruno was looked at as a leader. He was a smart guy, very intelligent kid, and was definitely someone that um, possibly realized that the money wasn't in owning a grocery store. If you wanted to have, a good woman on your arm, a nice woman on your arm, some money in your pocket, it wasn't working in the Italian market. It was becoming some sort of, street guy, if you will. Now, once Sabella becomes boss, if you will, from what Harry Riccobene would say. Now, look, Harry Riccobene is probably one of the most interesting people ever associated with the mafia in any family. Riccobene was made allegedly in his 16th year in 1927. He was made under Sabella. And yeah, the same Riccobene that fought with Nicky Scarfo in the 70s was made decades before. It was pretty incredible. He would say a couple of things, one of which was the Sabella group controlled certain aspects in the Italian market of loan sharking, bootlegging, protection rackets. And they were also kind of ushering out groups like the Black Hand, which were terrorizing residents. Now, Riccobene would also say that at the time that the group operated in kind of very territorial ways. So, like, if you were from Cacamo, you kind of ran with a certain group. If you were from Enna, you might run with a certain group. So it traced kind of all the way back to Italy. And that was kind of some of the early notion of the mob in Philly. So Bruno's coming up around a lot of criminality. This is a small Italian community dominated by his own people, which were Sicilians. They were his people. Now, in and around 1925, Bruno is known to hang out in and around 8th and Christian streets, which would become known as Dope Row. And, the people that were reading the paper every night, they were reading a lot about Dope Row. This was a very violent corner at 8th and Christian in South Philadelphia that was dominated by the selling of opium, heroin. There was a lot of murder. There were regularly shootouts involving Sabella's group and him protecting it from other groups. So things kind of, were right on the front page for Angelo Bruno. He was seeing a lot of this stuff go on. Now, in 1926, Angelo Bruno would drop out of South Philadelphia High School. Now, it was said by certain people he began extorting people in the neighborhood, but he realized by his 16th birthday that school wasn't really for him. And look, that wasn't that big a deal because a lot of people didn't go to school in those times. They would just go to work or delve into criminality. Now, as I said, Bruno's father was an ordinary guy. He was a grocery store owner. And Bruno would work for his father. He would stock shelves and he would, work as a cashier, but he had a business mind. He knew that he wanted more out of his life. Now, by the late 30s, Bruno is running the streets. He's working for his dad when he would meet a local woman, a woman called Susan Maranka. She was from the area of Federal Street in South Philadelphia. Now, from what I understand early on, Sue Maranka's father did not want her associating with Bruno because I believe she was from Calabria. I don't believe Sue Bruno was from Sicily. But from what I read, Sue Maranka's family wanted her to marry someone from, the same area that they were from, which Bruno wasn't. It didn't deter Bruno from talking to her. And they would ultimately be married by 1931. But it was the connection that Bruno made to Maranka's brother. Maranka had a brother called Ralph Maranka. And this is where Bruno gets into something that everybody else was into at this point, bootlegging. Bruno realizes that he can create some sort of illegal still and start distilling alcohol and bootlegging liquor. And there was money for everyone in bootlegging. It wasn't just the mob or Jewish groups that were doing bootlegging. There were regular people doing bootlegging. They were finding a way to make money because everybody wanted to drink alcohol. I mean, you look at today. I mean, go to your local town, right? Let's say you live in a town with 1,000 people. How many people out of those 1,000 do you think consume alcohol once a week even? Probably 80%. Everyone drinks alcohol. Now I know there are people that don't, and they're sober or they just don't like it. But alcohol is very critical to a lot of people's lives. And I'm not saying they need it to survive, but they enjoy it. They like drinking a beer after work. They like a glass of wine at dinner. Alcohol is something that is a woven fabric of America. And it always has been. And when the Volstead Act was introduced, all it did was create an illegal element, right? And it took street gangs to the next level. And we see that with people like Luca Luciano and Meyer Lansky and Angelo Bruno. Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia was very involved in his first business being alcohol. That's something he did right away. He would begin distilling alcohol out of a still and bootlegging liquor. Now, he was making good money doing that, even after Prohibition ends. Prohibition ends in the early 30s, but it didn't matter. He was still doing it. He was still making a lot of money. It's actually discussed that Bruno had been arrested several times at this point. He was actually arrested in 1928. And this is where not only in and around the time he marries Sue Maranka, but Angelo Annalaro, which he was known to up until this point, changes his name to Angelo Bruno. Now, Angelo Bruno changed his name to Bruno because his maternal grandmother's last name was Bruno. So he took her name and kind of assumes a different identity, if you will. Now, Bruno was making good money bootlegging, but he was also still working for his father, trying to maintain that normal, everyday guy vibe, but he's got money on the side. One thing I learned about Bruno is he was very, I don't know if humble's the word, but he was very like secretive, and it was smart. He did not want to flash cash ever. And there was a quote in the 70s by someone about Angelo Bruno is that his wife could write a check for $5 million, no problem, but you would never know it. And I would find this out like early in the life of Bruno, like in his 20s, he was very frugal. Didn't mean that he didn't let his wife have a good life, but he didn't want to portray the fact that he was this multi-millionaire, which at this point he wasn't, but he was always very cheap. Even in 1935, when he was busted by the feds at a still that he had, agents would find hundreds of gallons of alcohol. They hit him with firearms charges as well. He would plead not guilty, but he claimed he didn't have money for bail. he was smart enough to realize that most regular people in the neighborhood that work at a grocery store don't have money for bail. So Angelo Bruno willingly is in prison. He has no bail. Um, then randomly some mysterious person from the neighborhood puts up money for his bail and gets him out. Now, by this point, we don't know who that is. That could have just been someone in the neighborhood that was impressed by Bruno. They saw something in him. We don't know who it was. Was it John Avina? We don't know. John Avina was someone who took a liking to Bruno down the road, but we don't know who it was. One thing, though, we do know is there were people that were becoming impressed by young Bruno. He had taken a couple of pinches by now. He was making money, but he was still independent. He was not working under anyone. A lot of historical research, and what I find is you can't always take one word for it in this genre. A lot of historical research will tell you that Bruno was made into the mafia in 1931. That is not factual. In fact, Bruno would actually confirm that at one point in a sit down that was being recorded. He would say at one point, and we'll get into it, that this was in like the early 60s, that he was made about 10 years before that. And we'll get into when that is. So local gangsters are taking a liking to young Bruno, and he is starting to become on the radar of people. But 1931 is kind of a big year. 30 and 31 are big years because a lot is changing in the Philly mob and the national mob, if you will. As we know, around this time, Lucky Luciano creates what we know as the commission. And the original commission were these individuals. But it creates kind of this national hierarchy that, kind of it takes a lot of these groups from gangs, if you will, and organized, if you will, but more organized. In Philadelphia, Salvatore Sabella would actually step down. Remember, Sabella was still part of that conservative group, if you will, the Mustache Pete's. Now, that's not why I think he stepped down completely. However, when Masseria is killed, when Maranzano is killed, Sabella, I think, kind of sees the writing on the wall. And Sabella was an interesting guy because Sabella would leave his job as the head of the mob in Philadelphia in 1931. He had ruled for about 12 years. He was only in his 40s at this point. And Sabella would have some loose connections. In fact, the federal government would raid Angelo Bruno at one point and find a small address book. And they would find a certain person in his address book as Don Toridu or something like that. That was allegedly Salvatore Sabella. And Sabella would actually move around. He moved back to New York at one point. Then he settled in, I believe, Bristol, Pennsylvania. And he would actually become a butcher, from what I understand, and just live out the rest of his life in relative anonymity, which is kind of interesting. So Sabella steps down in the early 30s, and the boss of Philadelphia allegedly becomes John Avina. Now, John Avina is a gigantic numbers runner and racketeer. I mean, he's got a huge numbers bank. He's very involved in gambling. And this is the thing about the mob, guys. Like, we talked about prohibition and how people had a thirst, literally, for alcohol, right? But again, once that's repealed in the early 30s, it's a little bit easier to get alcohol. There's still a lot of illegal alcohol being produced, but then it transfers to gambling, right? Because another thing people love to do is gamble, and people like John Avina knew that. We talked about this, and we've went over this in a lot of episodes. The gradual changing of what organized crime groups are making money in. And in the 30s, it was absolutely gambling. And that's exactly, Bruno was always a visionary. He always saw what was next, and he always figured it out. It was first bootlegging. And then in the 30s, Bruno understands gambling. He understands numbers. And he starts getting involved by the late 30s, early 40s in the numbers business. And we would find that out because he would be arrested at one point in the area of 1905 South Broad Street, which is this is what it looks like today. That was the early residence of Angelo Bruno. He actually had some sort of apartment there. And they would raid his home and find him in possession of about 2,000 number slips. They were found behind a mirror. So Bruno starts moving into that racket, right? He starts making money in numbers. He's got some bootlegging still going on. He's becoming a pretty rich guy. Everybody wanted to gamble. Remember that. And a lot of these numbers rackets are fixed. No one ever wins. So you spend 1 cent, 2 cents, 3 cents. We did a recent episode on YouTube on some of the Puerto Rican numbers runners in New York City and the amount of money they were making in numbers, right? And what this would lead to then is Bruno makes money in numbers. He starts giving out loans on the street, which we'll talk about. By this point, though, Bruno still made it out that he was this, low level grocery store owner. In fact, when he was busted for the number slips, he claimed that he had no money and he sat in jail for 10 days until he found a way to get out. He wanted to push out the fact that he was just a regular guy. But in turn, once he gets out, he's one of the very important people in the underworld in Philly at this time. He's figuring out that if he pays people off, they won't bother him eventually. And the arrest pretty much stopped for the next 20 years for Angelo Bruno. I mean, he doesn't have to deal with much. He's paying off cops, certain neighborhood people. And by this point, he starts being affiliated with a guy called John Simone. Now, there is talk that John Simone was a distant relative of Angelo Bruno. They go back to the old country. And John Simone, in essence, early on, is kind of Bruno's protege, if you will. He starts getting involved with the gambling business as well. And this is where he starts kind of sowing the seeds that he's a leader down the road. Now, as I said, it was all really a kind of gradual change for Bruno. Bootlegging and gambling in numbers, then loan sharking. And when we say loan sharking, when it comes to Angelo Bruno, we're not talking about he was given thousands of dollars or anything, or $1,000. He's given tens of thousands of dollars. According to a confidential informant who had, quote, known Bruno for a long period of time, he would state to the federal government that Bruno was, quote, extremely wealthy and that he was active in lending money, not in small amounts, but specializing in lending large amounts of money to racketeers who have more income, most notably members of the Jewish mob in and around West Philadelphia, 69th Street and Upper Darby. These guys who are specializing in business, buying real estate and different things. Bruno was a big lender to them. He didn't work in nickel dime stuff on the street. Now, an informant also said that Bruno would make very big loans to various members of the, quote, Jewish mob and bankroll them in many of their activities. The informant would also say that these people, referring to those Jewish racketeers, were generally distrustful of banks and had a majority of their portion of wealth in their homes. They didn't believe in anything else. They kept it all in their houses. Now, at one point, it was also stated that it wasn't just Angelo Bruno that was a high-level loan shark, but another confidential informant would advise the government that Ralph Maranka, who was Angelo Bruno's brother-in-law, was also a loan shark, and that a certain individual was in debt to him for approximately $30,000, and that he stated he was having difficulty making ends meet and was paying Maranka off in small amounts each week. So this guy has several, and we could have to imagine John Simone would ultimately get involved with that. And look, John Simone we'll get into, he becomes a very important cog in Bruno's family when Bruno becomes boss. But we're still not talking about Bruno. Remember, at this point, Bruno is essentially independent. He's not with anyone. He's making his own money. The Philly mob, really up until he took over, was pretty, I guess, not organized, if you will. Now, I've heard a notion that, according to Riccobini, he would say that until the 40s, there was really no hierarchy in Philadelphia. It was just like loose base groups and things. Now, I'm not sure I totally believe that, but Bruno is not made. He's not with anyone. He's really not even claimed by anyone, but he's making huge money. And Bruno's also starting to make inroads in other cities. He's meeting other gangsters. He's making money from his huge loan shark business, and he's buying real estate. He's buying businesses. It was said by this point that Susan Bruno, Angelo's wife, lived really well, as did he, but they didn't show their wealth a ton. By this point, Bruno had two small children, a son called Michael, who was named after his father, as well as a little daughter called Jeannie. Now, they lived below their means, like I said, in a two-bedroom apartment on South Broad Street. Now, eventually in the late 40s, early 50s, Angelo Bruno would buy this home at 934 Snyder Avenue in Philadelphia, between 9th and 10th Street on Snyder Ave. Now, this home is still there today. You can go see this home. It was for sale a couple of years ago, and the neighborhood looks much different than it did then. But what Bruno does is what I always found interesting is he moved away from the Italian market, right? Not that far, but he moved away. He lived on Broad Street. He lived on 9th and 10th Street, further down from the Italian market. So he moves to this house, but still pretty nondescript. It's not like he moves to a mansion or anything. Now, we're kind of into the early 50s here, and Philly is changing yet again. Remember, for Bruno, he wouldn't become boss until the late 50s, and we'll tell you how. But John Avina was killed in 1936. A guy, Joe Bruno, takes over. And then in 1946, the boss of Philadelphia is a guy called Joe Ida. Now, Joe Ida was Calabrian, which is interesting. And he takes over from Joe Bruno, who was not related to Angelo Bruno, but he dies of natural causes. And Ida is the leader of one of the Calabrian factions. And he, weirdly enough, is the first non-Sicilian boss. And he's kind of making inroads with certain factions in the family. And he didn't actually live in Philadelphia. He lived up in Middlesex County, which is interesting. But, there were Philadelphia, as I said, was a very regionally based group, right? They had people in New Jersey. They had people in Newark. They had people in Bucks County, Bristol, Trenton, Delaware County, Montgomery County, Camden. They had people everywhere. And Joe Ida kind of headed this regional group. And they had faction in South Philadelphia, obviously, and people like Angelo Bruno. But Bruno's still just an associate. So Ida's the guy. And Ida, if you know anything about him, he was actually one of the guys that was at Appalachian. He was there with Antonio Polina, who we'll get into in a second. He was in attendance there. He was actually, involved with many others that were there as well. The problem is for Ida in 1957, he's exposed, basically, and he flees the United States. He's deported, and he leaves. So that would usher in a new boss, Antonio Mr. Miggs Polina. Now, Polina wasn't there for very long. And the problem that Polina had was Bruno, by this point, is really powerful, right? And I'm going to kind of talk about we've talked about his business sense, his business acumen, but Bruno is really powerful, right? And he's still not really, that thought of. He's not like a captain or an underboss. Angelo Bruno, was made into the mafia in 1951. Now, we take that from, as I said, many different historical records. And I want to talk about a pretty interesting report from a FBI file. And this comes from a confidential informant that he would advise the FBI that a person called Joseph Pane, they called him Pepe Longo, he had been killed in and around 1951. His body would be found on South 10th Street near Carpenter. He could not recall, the informant, the exact date of the murder, but said it was several years ago, probably around 1951. Now, the victim was purportedly killed for engaging in too much loose talk. Supposedly, he had been talking about people in the mafia like Frank Nicoletti and even Salvatore Sabello, who had long been gone, and that this guy was whacked. Now, he would also advise this informant that the chief hitters in this hit were none other than Angelo Bruno and Philip Testa. Now, Philip Testa was significantly younger than Bruno, but by this point in the early 50s, Phil Testa takes up with Bruno and becomes basically his protege. Now, as I said with Bruno, he was never regarded as a killer, but by the early 60s, there were 4 active files on Bruno involved allegedly in multiple murders as the shooter. And this would lead to the fact that he becomes made in 1951. He'd made his bones, and he was a soldier in the family. And his ascent is quite quick because Miggs Polina takes over in 1958. A beef is raised by Polina. He's kind of entangled in the fact that he knows that Bruno is quite popular. And they were very close. Miggs lived on 11th and Snyder, not far from Angelo Bruno. He was not popular in the family. Nobody really wanted him as the guy, but he's kind of just put in as acting boss. Now, at one point, a lot of people believed, and according to Bruno, he was asked to take over the family, but that he didn't really want to take over the family. But he starts getting certain allegiances from people, and he knows a lot of powerful people by this point. Angelo Bruno is close to people like Carlo Gambino by this time. And we know in the late 50s, Gambino takes over essentially a huge role in the national mafia, becoming the boss and creating the Gambino crime family. So Bruno is indebting himself with certain people. He's becoming very popular. And the boss, Polina, who's only in there for about a year, is not popular. The sentiment is, we want Bruno. We don't want him around. So Polina knows that. He contacts and kind of puts in the purview that he wants Bruno killed. He quote says, I want to break his legs and kill him. And that is a big problem because Bruno knows he's got to get to Polina or get Polina removed from power before he kills him. So Polina goes to his underboss, a guy, Ignazio Dinaro, and says, hey, kill Angelo Bruno, which Dinaro doesn't do because he's close to Bruno, which we would find that out in certain files that he knew Bruno back in the early 30s. According to an FBI file, Dinaro would be approached by the FBI at his place of business in and around 8th Street. He had a small barber shop and grocery store. And he would tell the FBI straight up that he had known Bruno since 1931 and that he didn't say anything about criminal activity. He just said he's a nice guy. I know him from the neighborhood. So Dinaro, in turn, is told to kill Bruno. He doesn't. He goes to Angelo Bruno. And Angelo Bruno goes and makes a beef with Carlo Gambino and says, hey, this guy's going to kill me. You should usher him out, shelve him, and I'll become the new boss. So what Polina does is step down, and the new boss in 1959 is Angelo Bruno. The commission sides with Gambino. It's all about connections, right? Everybody wanted Bruno to be boss anyway. He becomes boss in 1959. Now, not only was Bruno close with Carlo Gambino, which was basically the top guy in the country as far as the mob was concerned, but he was also very close with Northern Pennsylvania boss Russell Buffalino. Understand this, how big Pennsylvania is. These two guys, Buffalino and Angelo Bruno, ran Pennsylvania. Buffalino had Northern Pennsylvania, so Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, Hazleton, Shamokin, all these different towns. And Angelo Bruno had the Philadelphia area, the large swath of New Jersey and Delaware and South Jersey and Bucks County, Montgomery County, Trenton, all these areas. So extremely powerful. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Bruno's crew, if you will, at this point, because he had several of them. Bruno was obviously boss. He would make his old friend Dinaro the underboss. And the consigliere at this point is an old guy. He's been around for years, Joe Rugnetta. And this is how smart Bruno is. He realizes that he's the new guy in town, but he needs to make the older people happy in the family, the old guys, if you will, the guys that had been around since the 20s and the 30s, the Riccabinis, the Rugnettas. He needs to make those people happy, the John Capellos. So Rugnetta is someone who stays consigliere. And this is important because Joe Rugnetta is kind of underrated in the Philly mob because he was someone who really was kind of an ambassador to the family. Everybody, he kept and quelled any issues. And this allowed Bruno to rule in very certain terms. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Bruno's people. He had several people of his own. Obviously, we talked about Phil Testa. That was one of his proteges. He also had, a distant family member, John Simone. John Simone becomes a captain. He sends John Simone. John Simone's in Trenton by this point. He takes over criminal rackets in the early 60s. Several other members that were close to Bruno were Peter Casella, Harry Riccobini, Raymond Long John Martirano, and Felix Skinny Razor DeTullio. We know DeTullio was a hitter for sure. If you've ever seen The Irishman, Bruno's portrayed in that. We see a lot of Skinny Razor. Skinny Razor had his own kind of rackets and everything. And look at this large swath of area. I mean, what you're looking at is mostly under control of the Philadelphia crime family. The city of Philadelphia, Bucks and Montgomery County, Delaware County, Camden, Vineland, Bridgeton, the shore areas, up to Trenton, Princeton, Bristol, Newark, all those areas, they're all Philly territory. I want to talk about some of the rackets that Angelo Bruno was involved in because it's pretty incredible the amount of money this guy was making. He had a huge swath of territory. He had Johnny Key Simone as captain, John Capello, Joe Sciglitano. Philly had a big presence in Chester, Pennsylvania, up in Hazleton. Certain people were up there. Angelo Bruno also had, for a lot of his life, at least adult life, had some sort of residence in and around Miami. In the 60s, he would expand his regional businesses, including, by this point, he was very big in the vending businesses. He would expand his vending and jukebox operations down to areas of Florida. And he worked with Jewish mobsters to expand those businesses. He had a really good relationship with the Jewish mob as well, which is something you needed to have. He also had something in Philadelphia, an extermination business, which is quite interesting. Bruno had a company. In fact, he had several companies, pretty interesting, that he ran. He had a company in Trenton called Atlas Extermination Company, and he would go down to Florida and expand that business with none other than another powerful guy, Santo Trafficante. Alongside Santo Trafficante, they would create a company called Miami Pest Control. Other investments that Bruno was involved in were with Trafficante. They included things like a product sales company that sold aluminum in Hialeah. And Bruno also had maintained nightclubs, restaurants. He had a cheese company that he was involved in, and a restaurant, a bar owned by one of his top guys on the far left, Alfred Freddie Iezzi, in the area of 8th and Washington Avenues in Philadelphia. It was said also that Bruno was very involved in the trash business as well. Bruno was a multi-millionaire. He had money to the sky. Now, this is kind of problematic because this is something that, again, once you have decades of money making, you're going to start kind of bothering some of your people below you. Bruno's wife lived well. He lived well. We wouldn't know it. He lived in a little nondescript house on Snyder Avenue. But he was starting to get attention. Papers started picking up who he was. But he was still free of any sort of law enforcement. He had not been arrested for years. Now, there were certain points in the 60s, late 60s, that Bruno would spend in prison. A short time he would spend in state prison. And that was actually discussed by Philip Leonetti at one point in an interview. Now, in 1970, Ignazio Denaro dies, the underboss. What Bruno does is he makes his old friend and protege, Philip Testa, the underboss in the family. Now, the next 10 years involving Bruno are quite interesting because the relationship for him and Phil Testa is interesting because it's always been ornery. It's always been good. It's always been trusted. But Phil Testa, I have to wonder, at one point, we'll talk about kind of the beef that started between Testa. And I'm going to put out a notion at the end of this show that I want you guys to think about. Um, but what we know about Testa is in the 70s, he's integral in gaining some sort of control of Atlantic City. Now, the Philly mob has always had connection to Atlantic City. I mean, if you know anything about the early 20s, I mean, Jewish people were very involved in bootlegging in Philadelphia. But we don't know much about the Italian mob's control of Philadelphia in Atlantic City. But what we know is Nicky Scarfo was involved there. Nicky Scarfo, Phil Testa, a lot of people were connected to Atlantic City. In fact, this is Nicky Scarfo being arrested in 1964 in Atlantic City. Now, one thing we know about Atlantic City in the 60s is it's a dingy seaside town. There's not a lot going on. I mean, Scarfo talked about that. Leonetti mentioned that Atlantic City, I mean, Leonetti was from the area. He would talk about the fact that it was bereft of really any earning. And Nicky Scarfo struggled at times. You know, he was doing some bookmaking and things like that. He tended bar, but there weren't a lot of opportunities there. Now, I have heard researchers say, some say that Scarfo was banished there, but there are researchers that I trust and a lot of good ones, people like the Mob Archaeologists. They would say that they're not in the belief that that happened. In fact, if you look at Bruno and Scarfo's relationship, it always been quite good, and that there were a lot of reasons to believe that Scarfo was a lot more into the rules than we might think he was. Now, as we know, 1976 was a big year in Atlantic City because by that point, casino gaming was legalized. I believe it was 1976, maybe 1978, but the mid to late 70s were huge in Atlantic City because it goes from being a dingy seaside town to, you know, what it was in the 20s, except it's the 70s and casinos are booming, businesses booming, and the Philly mob had a foothold there. Testa had a lot of businesses down there. If you know anything about Phil Testa, the Trump Hotel parking was built on a bar called La Bistro, which was once owned by Phil Testa. And once he was killed in the early 80s, it went to his son, Salvi Testa. Testa had owned all sorts of property down there, and a lot of his estate and property was in Atlantic City. So he had been making inroads there for years. And this meant, yet again, for Angelo Bruno, there was going to be huge windfalls of cash. The problem, though, in the mid 70s for Bruno was twofold. We know Carlo Gambino dies. And so one of his visionaries is gone. So his influence in the commission is not as pronounced, Bruno, because Gambino was his guy. It doesn't necessarily have the relationship that he had with Gambino with others. Also, another big death would happen. Joe Rignetta dies. And as I said, Joe Rignetta was not a name that, you know, is going to move a lot of mountains in Philadelphia. But I think if you know anything about Joe, he was kind of that just guy that was, you know, he was a peacekeeper. He made it that stuff wasn't happening. He quelled fears. That's what a consigliere does. I mean, Joe Rignetta was born in 1896. I mean, he was around a long time. I mean, he had been the consigliere since the 30s. I mean, he was a long time member. Now, he dies in 1977, and these two deaths are really important because once Rignetta dies, you don't have that old guy that's kind of keeping people happy. And by this point, a lot of people were annoyed with Angelo Bruno, even Phil Testa. It was possible that, from what I understand, Phil Testa and Bruno had gotten to a point where they had beefs together. Bruno was approached by Testa, where Testa said, "Hey, I want to create my own family inside the family." That didn't go well with Bruno, and supposedly they were not exactly happy with each other by the late 70s. So a lot of things are happening for Bruno. You know, he's, you know, making money, but people are being ostracized in his family. He's taking drug money from different groups, but not letting his own family make money with drugs. And it goes back to the old notion of that conversation that other gangsters are having. I believe he's in Cleveland, where a wiretap picks up members of the Cleveland family talking about, you know, Angelo Bruno's wife could write a check for $5 million, but some of his people, their wives can't write checks for $5. So he's ostracizing people in his family, kind of like Paul Castellano did. Bruno did a lot of good things. By the end, people died that were important to him, that were keeping things in control. He was ostracizing people. And when Regnetta dies, that ushers in Tony Bananas Caponegro. Now, I found an interesting quote that was supposed to be put out by Caponegro in the late 50s. And this comes from the book Before Bruno. This is pretty interesting. According to Celeste Morello, in fact, what Tony Bananas Caponegro said was true. That he actually wanted to kill Angelo Bruno in the 50s, but he was not alone, though, too. There were certain people in the 50s, like Caponegro, that didn't like how Bruno hoarded his money and left them out of some things. He acted like a poor man and showed less spine. And Bruno was usually shamed into firing his gun. And people didn't like that. They didn't like how he was hoarding money. They didn't like that he wasn't violent. He wasn't getting the right people out of the way. Now, also, we would learn that in 1958, 1959, Caponegro had thought at that point about killing Bruno. So there was always kind of, I think, an issue with Caponegro. He felt maybe he should have more control when he didn't. And what happens is by the early 1980s, Caponegro makes a power play alongside some other people. And he's under belief that Fonzie Thierry of the Genovese crime family is backing him in a power play to take over Philadelphia. So basically, the state of New Jersey, the casino gaming happens, all that stuff happens. In 1980, Thierry sends a message to Caponegro that the commission would support him if he kills Bruno, and they would institute him as the new boss. So Caponegro allegedly puts this in motion. He gets in touch with John Simone, who's on board, Frank Sindone, who's on board, Alfred Salerno, they're all on board. And they want to get rid of Bruno. And we all know what happens next. March 21st, 1980, Angelo Bruno is at a restaurant. His driver drives him to the area of 934 Snyder Avenue, his home, and kills him. Bruno dies in front of his home. We've all seen that iconic photo. I'm not going to post it on YouTube because, we know what YouTube does. And that's that. Angelo Bruno is whacked. Now, history will tell us that Bruno was whacked because Caponegro wanted to take over. He wanted power. He wanted all the wealth. But I want to talk about some other theories to this. And I'm not saying that this is what happened, but I'm asking you to open your mind. I talked about the fact that Bruno and Testa were on the outs. They were allegedly not speaking in the 1980, early 1980. Was Phil Testa more involved with this than we think? And I have a reason to back that up. I want to talk about a conversation that was picked up on Wiretap between certain members of the Patriarca crime family, most notably Gennaro Angiulo and Ilario Zanino. After the murder, you had all sorts of people talking about this, and this was picked up on Wiretap. According to Zanino, who knew Tony Bananas, Caponegro, he would say, quote, I can't picture Tony Bananas clipping Angelo. He spoke about Angelo, about the fucking can, and about Angelo. He loved him. So here is a hardened member. I mean, Lars Zanino was a stone cold about the rules, very, very important member of the Patriarchal crime family. He says himself that he doesn't understand and doesn't believe, essentially, that Caponegro had engineered this. Now, he may have, and he was goaded into believing that the Genovese crime family and the high-ranking members of the commission approved this and they were going to institute him. We know that 2 weeks later, Caponegro was brutally killed and violated by members of the mafia, and he was indeed not made next boss. And we know John Simone was killed and Frank Sindone were all killed. They were all killed. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this conversation between Zanino and Gennaro Angiulo. At one point as well, they would say, basically, Angiulo would say, what will be the purpose of this? To which Zanino responds, who the fuck knows? Who knows, Jerry? And Angiulo would say, I mean, we are talking money here, right? How much fucking money they got there, meaning Philadelphia. And the notion of this was about money probably wasn't it. Zanino says Tony Bananas is a multi-millionaire. And Julo, I don't understand it. He has more fucking money than, what's the purpose? Zanino responds, power. They need power, Jerry. They get crazy. So it wasn't about money for Caponegro because Caponegro was very rich already. He wanted power. That said, there's also discussion in this wiretap about possibly, was Testa involved? Was there more to this than, it was just these guys? And it goes back to the whole power. They need power. Now, I'm not saying Testa had Bruno killed. I'm not saying that. But there is documented proof that Testa by the late 70s, early 80s, and Bruno were not happy with each other. Now, it could have just been a squabble between friends, and he was very unhappy. But remember, the next boss is Philip Testa. Now, he's killed in March of 1981, essentially a year right after Bruno. And that ushers in the Nicky Scarfo regime. Now, let's say that historical records are right and that Caponegro was the one that put this all in motion. The question is, who's the shooter that night? I don't believe it was Caponegro. Caponegro was, I want to say, in his 60s. I don't believe he was the shooter. I mean, he's a capo. Who's the shooter that night? We know John Stanfield was involved because he puts the window down, and he was someone who, weirdly enough, 20 years later would become the boss. But let's say Caponegro, that history is right, and that the Genovese backed this. You have to ask yourself why. Why did they back this? Well, I think it's pretty simple. The Genovese crime family by this point had been making inroads in New Jersey. If you know anything about Nicky Scarfo, he knew Genovese people. He was close to Gambino people. In fact, when he becomes boss, the commission approves it. So was there a secret deal where it said, you know what? Let's get the old guy Bruno out of the way. We all make money in Atlantic City, kind of like Las Vegas. We all make money here. Let's get this old fucking guy out because he's not going to share in anything anyway. I mean, remember, all of his people, Bruno's, were killed by this point. Gambino's gone. Not killed, but he dies. Rignetta's gone. He dies. Trafficante's basically, ushering his way out too. I mean, there's a lot of things that regionally the commission's most powerful, and they made inroads. It's a wild and interesting story, and I think it's one that's not talked about enough. We have heard so much about the Scarfos and the Merlinos, but we don't hear much about Angelo Bruno. We know he's the boss, and we know the fact that he's killed, but we don't know about his life. I hope you learned something today, and I hope you enjoyed this show. Angelo Bruno was a visionary. He was a huge moneymaker, huge earner. He kind of, in a weird way, became a very quiet guy, a guy who ruled for about 20 years. People made money. But in the end, like a lot of these guys, like Paul Castellano and people like that, not getting with the program, and we saw it in the 30s, not getting with the program is often your downfall. And I think Angelo Bruno, while he was a very big moneymaker and powerful guy, he was very greedy. And he, I think, ostracized a lot of people. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed the show. As always, make sure if you're checking us out on YouTube, you hit that like button. You also hit the subscribe button if you're new around here. And if you're listening to us through your ears on Google Pod, Spotify, or iTunes, leave us a detailed review, 5-star rating. Check us out on TikTok at the Sitdown Crime Pod. We're closing in on 100,000 subscribers. That would be great if I could hit that pretty soon. And yeah, check out all of our content. I also want to let you guys know, if you're interested in other content I'm doing, I recently partnered with Dominic Sicali, former member of the Bonanno crime family. We're doing a Patreon account. We're telling the life of Dom Sicali through Patreon. You can check that out. Patreon.com/the life of Dom Sicali. Patreon.com/the life of Dom Sicali. And I'll include that in the description of the audio and video. So check that out. It's cheap. It's a couple of dollars a month, and you're going to get some great stories, pictures, videos, all sorts of cool things. So if you want some more content, you can check that out. All right. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.